Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, books, and popular culture. Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Bruce Markison. As always, I'm joined by producer and co-host Tracy Asteria. Tracy, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing really good, Bruce. How's everything going with you this week?
We're doing okay. The heat wave here in upstate New York is over, at least for the moment. I'm sure we'll have a few more before the summer is said and done. And before we get to our guest tonight, we wanted to talk a little bit about our YouTube channel. You had some information to pass along to the folks that listen.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, definitely want to thank all of the subscribers and the listeners for their continued support. And I just want to mention that the Ghostly Gallery podcast does have a YouTube channel, and we premiere a new episode every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we just wanted to extend an invitation to everybody to come join us in the chat as we listen to some episodes and have some fun. Bruce always has some really great, interesting facts. And it's awesome to chat with other horror fans at the same time. So we definitely encourage you to pop on over if you have a chance, come listen and have a little bit of fun with us.
Absolutely. And people shouldn't be shy. If they want to listen in to the debut without chiming in on the chat, they can do that. But if they want to join us in the chat as well, we're pretty friendly. We're pretty easygoing. It's a lot of fun.
I think so.
Friday night. Yeah, I hope so. Very good. So, YouTube channel, Friday nights, in addition, of course, to debuting our newest episode Thursdays. And that is on, of course, Podbean and many other streaming platforms, including Spotify, Samsung, among others. All right. Well, thanks for that update, Tracy. And now on to our main attraction for this week's show. I'm excited about this. He's making his second appearance on the Ghostly Gallery podcast. He is an author, film producer, and director, Gary Don Rhodes. Gary has written many excellent books on horror film history and is particularly well known for his expertise on Bela Lugosi. I don't know if there's anybody that's around that knows more about Bela than Gary does. Gary's newest book has been out since the early spring. We encourage you to look this up on Amazon and purchase it. It's called Vampires in Silent Cinema. Takes a look at a lot of those great silent films that did feature vampire-like creatures, including Nosferatu. And it covers vampire films in total from 1896 to 1931. And there is extensive research on the 1922 classic Nosferatu. Again, that book is Vampires in Silent Cinema. And in terms of some of the other works that Gary has done, he has written, among other titles, Lugosi, His Life in Films, on Stage, and in the Hearts of Horror Lovers. Also has written Becoming Dracula, The Early Years of Bela Lugosi, and has written The Birth of the American Horror Film. Those are three of just many. Gary, welcome back to the Ghostly Gallery. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to spend another evening with yourself and Tracy.
Well, we certainly appreciate it. Really enjoyed the first time that you were with us and anticipating more of the same greatness the second time around. Not to put any pressure on you at all, but I'm sure you'll deliver.
Thanks very much.
We're going to talk to Gary tonight about two separate topics. One is a vampire screenplay that was actually written by the great author William Faulkner. It was supposed to be turned into a film, but that never happened. And we'll explain why that is and find out the latest developments on it. Gary had a chance recently to take a look at that manuscript. And then after we do the interesting stuff about William Faulkner and vampires, we'll then discuss the classic film Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, certainly one of our favorites. That film recently celebrated its 76th anniversary. It came out in June of 1948. So, Gary, let's begin with the Faulkner story, which I think is fascinating. He is best known for a number of books, including The Sound and the Fury. He also wrote film adaptations. And then he wrote a screenplay called Dreadful Hollow. And it's a vampire story. It was going to become a feature film directed by legendary figure Howard Hawks, but it fell through. It never happened. Why? Why is that the case?
Well, wonderful. I think it's a fascinating topic because at most maybe we associate Faulkner with the Southern Gothic. In some respects, maybe his 1931 novel Sanctuary has some horror elements, but certainly not of the horror movie or supernatural variety. The films we do know of him for, the screenplays, would be those for films like The Big Sleep. So he's obviously one of the best known, most well thought of American novelists of the 20th or really any century. But clearly not a figure we associate with the supernatural. So it's fascinating that he became involved. The film, unfortunately, went through more than one attempt to be made. Hawks tried on more than one occasion to make the film. The original plan, once the script was in hand, around the end of 1944, the original plan was for Howard Hawks to go to England. He was working with 20th Century Fox. The idea would be that he would shoot 2 films in England. Presumably, he was going to be using a couple of American stars, Hollywood stars, but probably the rest of the cast rounded out with some British actors. They would have shot these 2 films, one of them the vampire movie, in England in early 1945. That fell apart for a couple of reasons. Unfortunately, it seems that the progress of the war made the chances for shooting in a British studio a little more difficult in 1945. The other problem was that one of the other projects Hawks was interested in, it doesn't appear that he actually got the legal rights to it. And so that deal fell apart. Hawks, having this fascinating script written by William Faulkner, didn't give up. He tried to make the film again in around 1947. By that time, as a lot of the listeners will know, horror films were really in retreat as far as new films. And he tried again around 1951. Didn't happen then, although that year is the year we most associate Howard Hawks with horror films due to, of course, the fame of The Thing from Another World. Mm-hmm. So it's regrettable that this fascinating script was never produced, but it was completed. There are probably 2 original copies that exist. One in the with the Faulkner estate, which will not let it be shown or reproduced or made into a film. Certainly shown. And the other place that has it is the Howard Hawks Papers, which exist at a university in Utah, and that's where I was able to access the script.
Did you have enough time to look at the entire script, or did you only have enough time to sort of glance and maybe take notes here and there?
No, I was very fortunate. I was able to read the entire script twice and take notes over the course of about 8 hours. And it's a fascinating script. It was a first draft. It never moved on to a second draft. It was a very long draft. It almost certainly would have had to have been shortened because it would have been well over 2 hours had it been made, which would have been quite long for that period and particularly for a horror film. But I was able to read the entire thing. It was a very faithful adaptation of a 1942 novel by Irina Karlova of the same name, Dreadful Hollow. And the real question for me is, because it's such a faithful adaptation of the novel, I don't know, alas, whether Faulkner was so faithful because he wanted to be faithful to another writer, and that that he believed maybe that ethically he should be, or whether it is so very faithful because that would have, as well as very long, as that would have been, frankly, the quickest way to have finished the script. And so it may be because he wanted to finish quickly that he kept everything almost virtually the same, or some other reason, but it very closely follows what was a somewhat popular, somewhat well-reviewed vampire novel from 1942.
So you think it's good?
It's actually quite good. I know that there was an effort in the 1970s to get it produced again, and there's even been a little talk in the 21st century of this. I guess we see this happen with various filmmakers and unproduced scripts, the works of Stanley Kubrick and others that never originally got to the screen, and maybe we can finally do it. But I think it would have been particularly wonderful in the 1940s. It was about a female vampire. So in that way, it was more akin to something like Dracula's daughter than necessarily Dracula, although the novel and screenplay bear some similarity to Bram Stoker. A vampire, in this case, a female vampire from Transylvania, makes her way to other European locations. The novel takes place by the time this vampire is living in an old house in England. That's, again, why Hawks had hoped to shoot there, of course. And not surprisingly, this very old woman becomes very young once she drinks the blood of a local boy. She also has her sights set on a young lady that works for her. And so it's quite fascinating. There's some really wonderful moments in it.
Do you think there's anything in the content that was considered controversial for the time and that may have also affected the ability of this thing to get produced?
Well, I do think that's a real possibility. If not that it kept it from getting produced, it would have probably had to have been changed. There's very much a kind of, as there is with Dracula's daughter, but even really more so here, kind of lesbian overtones with regard to the female vampire, a countess. And so that probably would have had to have been tempered, because those issues of kind of same-sex attraction as regards vampire movies had come up even in the scripting of Dracula, the Todd Browning film that ended up starring Bela Lugosi. We know from some notes that Carl Laemmle Jr. was very clear that, Dracula shouldn't be seen to be attracted to Renfield and so forth. We also see this show up in other ways in later films. In, say, Son of Dracula in 1943, when Dracula bites a male, he does so in bat form rather than biting him in human form on the neck. So there would have probably, yes, had to have been a bit of that. I would say the most censorship concerning thing that would have probably been a red flag for the Production Code Administration of the time, the PCA, the body that kind of oversaw Hollywood's films and made sure everybody adhered to the production code. In Faulkner's script, as well as in the novel, there is a servant that the vampire countess has, a woman she's known since her childhood. And in one scene, this woman has a big pot of blood boiling on the fire, on the oven, stovetop, I should say. And, that would have certainly been verboten to show so much blood in a film that would have been finished presumably in 1945, the first attempt to make it. So certainly there were some things there that were too edgy for Hollywood at the time, no doubt about it.
Yeah, stovetop blood, I could see that in 2024, but 1944 or 45, different story.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. What about the Faulkner estate? You mentioned that they have one of the two existing copies, and they have indicated they don't want it to see the light of day. They don't want it to see it made into a film. Have they given any reason? And if not, any speculation as to why they're taking that approach?
Well, it's more that they haven't want it published, and they don't have it available for Faulkner scholars. Now, of course, one, as I did, and a few others have as well, can kind of circumvent that by going to the Hawks papers, because Hawks had paid Faulkner to write it. So the rights to the script would presumably be Hawks' estate, and I believe his estate would like to see a film made. All I know for really any certainty is I think there were certain of the greatest American novelists like Faulkner, like Hemingway, like certainly F. Scott Fitzgerald and others whose great fame led them to receive Hollywood contracts, but Hollywood studios, the factory system of screenwriting, didn't really suit those kind of individualistic artists. I suppose some viewers may even remember the Coen brothers' take on this in their dark comedy Barton Fink, which is a kind of a bit of a play on these types of writers' problems in Hollywood. So I can imagine, among other things, Hawks didn't seem to love his Hollywood period, and so that's another reason that. That even though I think it's a wonderful and delightful script, that he may have not even spent that much time on it.
Gary, I was just wondering, if that film was made today, how do you think that would be received by audiences?
Well, I think, the thought of a writer like Faulkner deigning to work in horror, I think we might see a bit more of that with modern writers and an interest in things like horror, as well as some great filmmakers. But of course, in the 20th century and certainly in the 1940s, horror was often seen as, contemptible, not worthy for great artists, for great writers, and so forth. So Faulkner's name attached to it. He was certainly, for the classic horror period, the most famous writer attached to a horror film, even though this one didn't get made. So I think that there would be some real interest in viewers thinking, gosh, here's a William Faulkner vampire film. It's quite an unlikely thought. By contrast, even with its kind of sexual overtones and blood boiling on a pot on the stove, in a pot on the stove, the reality is it's very much written in the style of 1940s horror films. So I think what might have been seen as a little too graphic or so forth at the time, now I think the script would almost certainly have to be changed to be more palatable to modern audiences, because it's very much a 1940s style horror script and story.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Gary, is it true that this screenplay was unavailable to the public for a long period of time? Is that really the case?
Yes, it was. In fact, Bruce Kawan, who wrote a book on Faulkner and film back in the 1970s, he had special access to it through Hawks' estate, and nobody else saw it for years, for decades. And until the 21st century, a few other scholars have been able to look at it at the University Archive, where Hawks' papers are. And again, it's only because they're in the Hawks' papers that one can look at it. Even then, while I made copious notes and will be publishing about it, including excerpts from it, very limited in terms of fair use copyright, you can't make photocopies of the script even in the Hawks' papers and so forth. So it's a rare thing to see. I think the few people who have seen it before have been Faulkner scholars, and they've been very rightly interested in it from their standpoint. I believe I'm probably the first kind of horror scholar to look at it, coming at it more from vampires and horror history and lore, as opposed to coming at it from, say, being a Faulkner biographer or something like that.
Was it a difficult process for you to get to see this archive, or did they make it fairly easy for you, given your background?
Fortunately, they were wonderful. I would encourage anybody that's really interested in these things to go read the script, because it's, at this point, thankfully, it is possible to view it if one's a scholar, if one makes an appointment. It's a fascinating read. As I say, I'll be covering it in some detail in a forthcoming publication. But if anybody really wanted to get to know the script without, say, traveling hundreds, thousands of miles, spending hundreds of dollars and so forth, travel expenses, I would encourage anybody that's really interested to simply find a used copy of the 1942 novel Dreadful Hollow because they're so close that you could get a great idea of the basic storyline of Faulkner's script simply by reading that wonderful and regrettably forgotten 1942 novel. And so maybe an eBay or used bookstore purchase could help out more people to get to know it.
Well, that's certainly a great suggestion. Let's talk a little bit, Gary, about possible casting for that film back in the mid-1940s. I have read that Bela Lugosi, who would later become Vampira, was scheduled to play the lead. Any idea if that's true?
Well, I think it's one of these fascinating, possibly true statements. Hawks had known her by the time he was prepping the film, but he was also prepping another film that he was also going to make, a mystery film in England. There's absolutely no trade publication or material in the Hawks papers, which in addition to the script itself cover some of his plans and even telegrams with studio bosses and so forth for Dreadful Hollow. There's absolutely no evidence that she was selected for that role. But by contrast, what we know for sure, as another writer pointed out, he did know her by that time and was interested in her as an actress. So maybe, I think if we put ourselves back into the world of 1944-45, it certainly would have been fascinating if she had played it. Maybe he was thinking about her. That's very possible, but we don't know for sure. And in 1944-45, nobody really knew of her, let alone thought of her in terms of the horror genre. It'd be another decade, obviously, before she became Vampira. So I think it's a real possibility, but it certainly is. I think it remains as much speculation as it does fact. It's somewhere in between. What we do know for sure is that the studio, quite expectedly, as 20th Century Fox, wanted there to be one or two stars in it. That doesn't mean they would have been necessarily top Hollywood stars, almost certainly not, because top Hollywood stars so rarely appeared in horror films at the time. Mm-hmm. But some notable, say, starlet, as they were called at the time, up and coming, so forth. It could have been Nurmi, but there's absolutely no definitive proof that she had been cast. In fact, there's no definitive proof that anybody had been particularly cast, because the script never got past the first draft, and the production fell apart. Since he tried to make it on subsequent occasions, he may have even, his mind kind of cycled through various possible actresses for the female lead vampire, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more in 1945, and then even more as he thought about the film again in subsequent years.
It's hard for me to judge her as an actress. I mean, she was a lot of fun as Vampira for that one season on the ABC affiliate in LA. But when you're judging someone based on Plan 9 from Outer Space, it's hard to make an assessment. I haven't really seen any of her other films, so I don't know how well she would have done.
No, and Hawks obviously didn't end up working with her in any capacity for us to see that collaboration. I think that's one of those wonderful things that gets written about in film history, where it sounds fascinating and, oh gosh, Vampira might have starred in a Faulkner written and Hawks produced and directed vampire film. Maybe that would have happened, but in all likelihood, had this gone forward, I don't see that as having been likely.
Yeah,
because she was so totally unknown at the time.
Gary, one final question on this topic, and I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here. And if you don't have a good answer, that's fine. I don't know that I do either. But if it were ever to be made today, can you think of an actress in today's Hollywood that might be a good fit for the lead in that role? Anybody jump to mind?
Oh, I suppose as soon as you started asking, that's a fascinating, wonderful question. As soon as you started asking, I probably would think of somebody like Christina Ricci.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating character in the script because the vampiress, the countess, is old, and of course she becomes young, drinking blood. But there's also a flashback sequence to her mother, who also bore the curse of vampirism. So presumably, whatever actress, past, present, future, might have ever played the role, and I can see Christina Ricci fitting the character. Or even somebody like the star of Michael Almereyda's Nadia, from the 1990s. But the same actress in all likelihood would play not only herself as elder vampire, as younger, refreshed vampire, but also quite possibly their mother as well. So it would be it is a fairly juicy role for an actress should it ever get made.
Well, I think Christina Ricci's a great choice. That's an excellent answer. I wasn't thinking of her, but that makes perfect sense. It's a fascinating topic. The William Faulkner screenplay, the book was based on Dreadful Hollow, came out in the mid-1940s, has never been made into a film. The Faulkner estate does not want it to be made into a film. Maybe that will change sometime down the line. Great stuff on that, Gary. Let's move on to maybe a bit of a lighter topic, but one that we'll have a lot of fun with. And it's another item from the 1940s, specifically the 1948 film Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This was one of the movies I grew up on in the 1970s. WPIX Channel 11 in New York City used to air Abbott and Costello films and TV reruns every Sunday morning. Before Yankee games, most Sundays. And the one that they showed so often, and it was always a treat to watch, was indeed Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. We recently celebrated the 76th anniversary of this classic film. It came out, as you've reported, June 15th, 1948. So we want to explore this in some depth. Given that Universal had moved away from horror by the mid-1940s, and you referenced this earlier, why did the studio decide, let's go back to horror? Let's try this production in 48. Why'd they give it a go?
Well, it's a wonderful question, wonderful film, one of my favorites, too, to my youth in the 1970s, and one that I think, like so many horror fans, I find myself watching once a year, certainly Halloween season and so forth. Delightful movie. And I think reading some of the trade publications at the time, some of the little bit of studio files and materials I've seen, not too many on that film, alas, but what I have seen does make it seem that the studio saw it more as another Abbott and Costello film than they did a revival of the horror film, which had really at Universal kind of screeched to a halt in 1946. It's an interesting thing that post-war period, a lot of horror films were getting reissued, Universal and otherwise, but not much in the way of new horror film production. What I gather, and then we could even trace this back to earlier Abbott and Costello films, particularly something like Who Done It, which is a bit of an old dark house spooky comedy with Abbott and Costello. It looks like this was another effort to do Abbott and Costello more than it was to bring the monsters back. Nevertheless, they're there. We're so thankful they're there. Why did they choose to throw them into what, even if it was seen predominantly as an Abbott and Costello film? I think that they would have been aware that most comedy teams by that point had met monsters before. This would be true with, say, Wheeler and Woolsey in the 30s, with Mummy's Boys, where they met, obviously, a mummy. The Ritz Brothers and The Gorilla, where they met Lugosi and Lionel Atwill. So many of the comedians and comedy teams had encountered monsters. It wasn't an entirely new idea. For that matter, at RKO with Brown and Carney, the comedy team, largely forgotten, Lugosi had not too long before, a couple of years earlier, starred in Zombies on Broadway, where a zombie and Lugosi, the Mad Doctor, met this largely forgotten comedy team. So I think that it was seen largely as an Abbott and Costello film. What can we do? I mean, Abbott and Costello had gone west. They had gone into so many different businesses and topics, ride 'em cowboy. I mean, all different kinds of subjects. They'd been in the Navy, they'd been in the Army, etc. It was not unexpected that they would meet monsters because so many others had.
That's interesting. Was this somewhat of a reclamation project for them? Had Abbott and Costello's popularity dipped prior to this?
It had dipped somewhat, yes, in the mid-40s. And I think it's an interesting thing when we look at that period, and if we look at it even more broadly than horror or comedy, there's an interesting thing that happens. We know, of course, World War II ends in 1945. There's the return of so many soldiers from abroad, and the baby boom starts and all of that. And the idea was that everybody's going to get more money, more popular in terms of Hollywood. There'll be more tickets sold because all these soldiers are coming home. And in 1946, that was kind of true. 1946 was a really great year for Hollywood. But then 1947 started a series of years that were completely terrible, in some respects worse than the Great Depression. So yes, a lot of people saw their popularity fading in 46, 47, 48. There were all kinds of new competition for films in general, not just television, which we often mention thinking about that period, but the rise of bowling, the rise of minor league baseball had already existed, but much more popular. There was all of a sudden many other leisure activities that people engaged in. So a lot of people saw their popularity decline, and Abbott and Costello's were not as popular in 45, 6, 7 as, of course, they had been in, say, 41, 2, 3.
Interesting. Is it true that Bela Lugosi lobbied very hard to get this role?
Well, we don't know for sure.
Okay.
The number one person where those stories come from was one of his managers, a fellow named Don Marlowe. And Marlowe claimed to have, yes, lobbied very hard for Lugosi. He had a very elaborate anecdote he would tell this manager in later years. Certainly by the 1970s, he was telling this story that he had lobbied so hard at Universal's offices on behalf of Lugosi, and that, oh goodness, Dracula had really, its success in 1931 had so much been a part of saving the studio from ruin in the Great Depression, and how they owed Lugosi the role, that type of thing. Regrettably, Marlowe, while he was very definitely Lugosi's manager, they were extremely closely associated with one another in 1947 and 8. Regrettably, Marlowe's stories were not always true. He claimed, among other things, to have been the character Porky in the Our Gang Little Rascal shorts, and he very much was not. So Marlowe was somebody, he even wrote a book about his time in Hollywood, and some of it's very definitely true, some of it's very definitely not. So that's when I say we're not sure. It's because most of what we know comes from a less than reliable source. What we do know is that Lugosi had not portrayed Dracula in either House of Frankenstein in 44 or House of Dracula in 45. And of course, this strikes a lot of us even now as at strange, if not mystifying. How could have they Universal made films without Lugosi, other actors cast? But they very definitely did that. They did it also with the Frankenstein monster, of course, other people portraying him. Other than Karloff. So it wasn't a certainty that Lugosi had to play the role in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, because they had used John Carradine instead in those other films. Obviously, whatever it was that caused them to sign Lugosi, obviously, I think the world's been forever grateful since. And I have no doubt that Lugosi was, because like so many others, and worse than even many of his Hollywood friends and colleagues, his career was in a terrible shape in 46 and particularly 47 vis-a-vis Hollywood. 1947 was really the first year that he had not made a Hollywood film since the late 20s.
Wow.
So he was out on the road, all kinds of small vaudeville appearances, a lot of them actually booked by this manager I mentioned, Don Marlowe. And so to get not only a film role, but to get it in a major Hollywood production, that had to have been something he desperately wanted, and we're desperately forever happy that he did get it. Exactly how that unfolded is a wee bit tough to know, though. Like so many Hollywood stories, there's an exchange in Cormac McCarthy I love where one character says, "Is that a true story?" And the other character responds, "Well, it's true. It is a story." And I think that's where we're often left with anecdotal history, oral history, interviews, primary sources. The fish gets bigger with every retelling. That was caught at the fishing trip. I think some of that was probably going on with Don Marlowe, but we're not absolutely sure.
Yeah. You mentioned Carradine, and he was okay in those two movies, although his role was somewhat limited. I thought Lon Chaney Jr. was surprisingly good in Son of Dracula, but he's already playing the Wolfman in Abbott and Costello, so there's no way he can play both that and Dracula at the same time. And you're right, it turned out to be a great move. Even though he was over 65 years old, Lugosi is remarkably good here. I make the argument, maybe it's a bit crazy, but I think he's better here than he was in 31.
Well, I certainly know a lot of people who share that feeling, and it's one I understand, and I think it's not only understandable, but it's admirable because I think what we see is not only is he so much older than in the 1931 film, quite obviously, this is roughly 17 years later, but his portrayal of Dracula has changed. The portrayal based upon his own acting as well as certain elements of the script, it's a very different Dracula than we get in 1931. In 1931, he's speaking in a very slow manner, and he moves slowly, almost as if underwater, I feel. And it's wonderful. It's almost hypnotic for some of us as viewers. I think it's also somewhat befitting a regal character like a count, But then we see him moving rapidly and fighting over a gurney, a hospital gurney with the Wolfman, and even throwing a flower pot at the Wolfman. He literally picks up a flower pot and throws at Lon Chaney's Wolfman. And these are kinds of physical action, running and fighting physically that's certainly totally absent, I would think, other than him smashing the mirror, that's really absent in the 1931 film.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very different performance. And what had happened in the meantime was, of course, that Lugosi had become he had become Dracula to the nation and the world after the success of the 31 film. He had played Dracula in many revivals on stage. He had played Dracula in vaudeville acts, and he had played Dracula-like characters many times, even in something of kind of parodies of himself. The first time, he really appeared on screen in a way that was a comical Dracula was in a 1932 short subject some of the viewers may have seen, Hollywood on Parade, where he bites Betty Boop. He tells her she's booped her last boop, a live actress playing, a live action actress playing Betty Boop. And so, I think that he had changed a great deal in the ensuing years. He had not only gotten older and remarried, child, his son, Bela Jr., still living wonderfully, a great friend of so many of us. But I think he had played Dracula so many times, including in so many comedic skits, often even on radio programs. So I think his portrayal, to come back to where I began, his portrayal in the 1948 film, I think it's quite logical to see it as better or equally interesting or different, because it is. It's a very different portrayal. It's not the Dracula of 1931 in ways far beyond the fact he was simply an older gentleman by that point.
Yeah. And even though he's in his mid-60s at this point, he looked okay. I mean, we know that in later years, he had the drug addiction. He got very, very thin. very frail looking, even beyond frail. We don't see that in 48. Now, maybe part of it is good makeup, but he did seem to be in fairly decent physical condition.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we know of some of his health problems even. Well, I would immediately think of Robert Wise, the great director, told me that, Lugosi on the set of The Body Snatcher, 1945, that film was, ill part of the time. And he had canceled various live appearances in 47 due to illness. At least that was the stated claim. But I agree with you completely. He looks really quite tremendous for his age in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Sure, there is obviously some white makeup and so forth on him as Dracula, but his physique seems to be of somebody who appears to be in we'll say much better health than we think of him just a few years later. He doesn't seem as thin as we so often think of him being in the 1950s films. So I think he seems to be in really good shape. He seems to be enjoying himself. I think even some of the wonderful exchanges, where of course he's considered to be Dracula by Lon Chaney's Lawrence Talbot. And then, of course, he says, well, it's just the costume, perhaps. And, of course, Dracula had become a costume by that point. And it's one that fit him still quite well because he is in very good health there.
Yeah.
At least he certainly appears to be.
Right. You mentioned Lon Chaney Jr., who is excellent in his dual role as Talbot and the Wolfman, but he hated the movie. He once said of this, Abbott and Costello ruined the horror films. They made buffoons out of the monsters. I don't really buy this argument at all from him. What do you think of it?
No, I wouldn't agree with that either. And I think we could go back to some of the films I've already mentioned, as well as a number of others. I mean, before that film, he had been in comedies himself. He and Peter Lorre, Karloff, Lugosi had been in the comedy You'll Find Out. Lugosi and others had worked with various comedy teams. Lugosi with the East Side Kids. I didn't even mention those couple of films earlier, like Spooks Run Wild and Ghosts on the Loose. Horror and comedy, and had been such a long time match. I mean, really dating back before any of these people were stars, any of these actors, before the Universal horror films, the kind of comedy, old dark house films and so forth had existed since the earliest days of the cinema. So I don't agree with that argument either. What I do believe is that the horror film was one of the last casualties of World War II in terms of entertainment. The old style Gothic horror films really died out in 45, 46, and they don't really return until 1957, 58. With some American films and most famously the Hammer productions. In between, there's limited horror, and then it becomes kind of horror sci-fi. So I think there were changes. If he noticed he didn't get to play Wolfman many more times, that's very true. But it's not because of that single film. In fact, I immediately think when we talk about that, and I disagree with it as well, but when we talk about that, I remember another wonderful quotation from Lugosi at the time when he said to an interviewer, well, the boys, Abbott and Costello, they're the ones that do all of the antics, and I still play the character straight. And so my trademark character is unblemished. And so he saw it in a very different terms, So no, I wouldn't agree with Lon Chaney on that either.
Oh my goodness. I personally really enjoyed this film. I think that Abbott and Costello, they put such a different spin on like horror and comedy. And I think it's kind of like a great little introduction for kids just to get into the world of exploring Universal monsters. And I just really liked it. I think it would have been really interesting to see Boris Karloff play Frankenstein. Personally, I love that actor, and I thought he was really polished in his role when he did play Frankenstein. What did you think of Glenn Strange playing the Frankenstein monster in this movie?
Well, yes, I think we were talking about how Dracula changed as a character over the years at Universal, the 30s to the 40s. Certainly the Frankenstein monster changed as well. And not just in terms of the actors playing the character, but really from Frankenstein meets the Wolfman onwards, the monster was really just more of a depicted as kind of a dumb brute. And so on the one hand, we don't get that kind of great humanity that Karloff brought to the role, or even I think that to some extent Chaney was able to do in Ghost of Frankenstein, particularly in the scene with Janet Ann Gallo, the little girl looking up at him, and him deciding, of course, not to harm her. The character changed as well. On the one hand, I think Strange's physical features and face are so often what a lot of people think of, even as much or more than Karloff, when they think of the Frankenstein monster, because he really, that facial feature and look of him, I think, became very much the template for a lot of the masks and Halloween costumes and so forth, toys and so forth of the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yes.
That said, he is just basically a dumb brute. He does get to speak in this film a little bit, which is unique because he hadn't spoke in some of the other films, the character, despite learning how to speak in Bride of Frankenstein, to speak English. So I think he's interesting. It's regrettable it wasn't Karloff, who hadn't played the role since 1939 in a feature film, at least. And the closest Karloff came to the film was that I think the studio paid him a little bit of money to stand in front of some of the posters in New York, and they took publicity pictures of him looking at it. Of course, Karloff was, I think, a real beneficiary, at least to some extent, of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, because he appeared in 2 of the subsequent Abbott and Costello monster movies. Meet Killer Boris Karloff and then Jekyll and Hyde. So I think he was something of a beneficiary of the film to an extent without having appeared in it. But we get I think it's wonderful because we get Chaney back as Talbot in the Wolfman, and he's good. He's such a divided character because he's trying to be even more of a good guy really than Abbott and Costello. Bud doesn't even believe in the monsters initially, etc. Obviously, he becomes ravenous and bloodthirsty when he turns into the Wolfman. We get this incredible little bit cameo of Vincent Price as the Invisible Man, and he, of course, had been the Invisible Man already. And then we get this one-off character that I'm completely fascinated by, Dr. Sandra Mornay, as played by Lenore Aubert. And I think, it's funny when we look at this film because it is a comedy. I think it's still hilarious. I love it. They seem, Abbott and Costello, to my eyes, I've watched all of their films, and they seem more youthful and energized in it than they had in the films they made over the previous few years. It's like watching them almost in their first couple of years of films again. So they seem really at the top of their game. So wonderful, so funny. But then we have this really dark figure of Dr. Mornay. Dracula, Lugosi, at one point talks about the European police looking for her. And it flies over a lot of people now, quite rightly. It's only a couple of sentences. It's very brief dialogue. But in 1948, for any adult watching the film, even somebody that was a teenager, that they would have known the sheer amount of newspaper coverage of, say, the hunt for Nazi criminals, including doctors, and so forth. So she seems to have some potential horrible crimes in her past associated with the European theater, the war theater, the Nazis, presumably, although they're not specifically named. And then, of course, she's so terrible that the Frankenstein monster literally just throws her out the window and to her death. And, it's not normal in horror films to just be killing a lot of women. Of that period, I mean, obviously something we associate with later horror films. So there's some kind of dark moments in this film with all of its tremendous humor. And of course, it is a comedy. In my own research, one of my favorite things is looking at some of the theater manager reports on these old films, where individual theater managers would write in a few sentences saying how well the film did, how their audiences responded. And this film was quite successful, of course, but at the same time, a lot of theater managers reported that their Saturday crowds had so many crying children because they were scared of some of the scenes, some of the monsters. So we think of it as overall so funny, and it was to us, and we love it, and rightly so, and it is tremendously funny. It was meant to be. But some little kids at the time still saw parts of it as very scary. And I personally, as I've thought about certain aspects of the film, like the European police wanting Dr. Mornay, some of it has become a little bit scary to me as an adult. Scary, not like frightened, but scary in terms of the shadow of some of the Nazi horrors seem to be there in her character. So we don't get Karloff, but we get some interesting folks.
Oh, absolutely. It was a total enjoyable movie. I loved it so much.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I never had thought of that, Gary. That character, Dr. Mornay, there was potential to do more. They could have done a follow-up film just on her, maybe brought her back to life in some way. Another one of the real strengths, Gary, to the movie, I think, is the castle, which is so elaborate, so gothic. I think that's really a key.
Oh, it's tremendous. I think as a kid, one of the things that gripped me most was that castle and also the special effects, specifically the wonderful use of animation to transform Lugosi into bat form or vice versa. So I love that. I actually lived in Florida for a few years when I was a professor at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. I explored Florida, not completely, but as a little bit, more than a little bit. And I never saw a Gothic castle there because the film's supposed to be set in Florida.
Yeah.
And the bulk of it, except for when Chaney's in London, I guess. But I don't think that really matters because, like so many of these films, it invents a kind of a mythical place. And so it's a kind of a mythical post-war Florida. And so why shouldn't it have an amazing Gothic castle on some little island just off the shore?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Another strength, the final 10 minutes or so, when Dracula does battle with the Wolfman and then Wilbur and Chick are simultaneously trying to elude the monster. One of our friends, great writer Frank Dell'Istrito, has talked about how wonderfully choreographed those final scenes are, that battle scene in the castle. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly agree. I think when I was talking about Dracula and the Wolfman kind of pushing a hospital gurney back and forth, Dracula throwing a flower pot, that's part of that choreography. I think it's a wonderful thing that horror films have done for so very long. I don't know exactly where the notion was invented, but this whole idea of, if you've got a handful of characters, you split them up, and you're able to kind of cut back and forth, cross-cut between them. So Dracula and the Wolfman are having their part of the castle fight. We get, obviously, Bud and Lou and the Frankenstein monster, as you say, elsewhere. I think, this is that kind of thing where, well, I suppose every episode of Scooby-Doo did it, where you and Velma go that way and Fred and Daphne go the other way, and you split up characters to heighten the chances for horror and the chances for suspense because, they're not all together in one single room, single group. So it is a wonderfully choreographed moment. And we get, I don't know, I've always wondered, and perhaps you have thoughts, exactly how Dracula dies. Clearly, the Wolfman grabs him right after he's turned into bat form, and they tumble into the rocky waters below. Whether it's rocks or something like that kill them, whether it's the Wolfman's ripped into him with his claws on the way down, whether it's drowning, or whether it's even that wonderfully fascinating old folklore that vampires can't cross water, that water, moving water like a river or stream is anathema to them, or even potentially destructive to them in some of the folklore. There's even that's part of that wonderfully choreographed kind of ending. And it's, I think, kind of enigmatic because we don't know quite what's killed Dracula, even though, of course, we are meant to assume his death.
That's a great point, because first time I saw the movie, and this was way back in the 1970s on WPIX, I wasn't sure if Dracula had died. He's in bat form, but did the Wolfman let go of him? Did the bat drown? That's never quite made clear to me. And, in subsequent showings, you maybe just take it for granted. But yeah, that first time, I really did wonder. They kind of left that a little open-ended. One final question on this great film, Gary. Your thoughts on the final scene on the dock when Bud and Lou, playing Wilbur and Chick, are in the boat. And what does Bud keep saying? Tie up the boat or no, untie the boat. He keeps saying it over and over.
Yeah.
And of course, Lou is incapable of doing that very quickly or very smoothly. And then simultaneously, you have the Frankenstein monster coming out onto that dock. And then there's the other character, kind of a heroic character, the good-looking guy, comes up with a brilliant idea of setting fire to the other end of the dock. And that essentially traps the Frankenstein monster. I think it's a wonderful finish. I really like it. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, no, I absolutely love it. And it is kind of part of, I think, that 1-2 punch where we get the brilliant scene you've just talked about, which I love so much. And then we get the unexpected Vincent Price cameo as the Invisible Man. So it is kind of a great little, even additional punchline at the end. What I love about that scene is that it takes, like various parts of the film, it takes from previous films or previous lore about the monsters, like obviously the Frankenstein monsters, a fear of fire, dating to, in terms of Universal, dating to the very first film from 1931. So one of the great things, though, about that scene and about the film in general is it revisits some of these common tropes that Universal's established, in some cases established even earlier in literature, previous films, but then it finds a fresh way of working with it. So yes, all of a sudden the slow-moving monster is caught in fire and concerned about it, fearing it. It kills him. But the whole time we have Lou throwing things from the boat rather than untying it, as you say, and obviously that keeps them in close proximity to the monster. It's not unlike I think the common horror movie trope that what happens when a killer is chasing a victim in the woods? What must the victim do? Well, obviously they must stumble and fall at least once so the killer can get ever closer. And that builds up a little suspense that, well, here Bud and Lou aren't falling down or tripping, but it's kind of the similar device because the boat's still tied up. So I think it's a wonderful way with the fire of revisiting the past, but in a way that also still seems fresh and new. I mean, we are trying to get the monster back to full strength. We don't actually have a Dr. Frankenstein. In some ways, Dracula performs that role. He's the one that's obsessed with getting the monster back to his full strength. So we have Dracula, in essence, becoming, at least in some scenes, in some ways, Dracula becomes Dr. Frankenstein, to the extent that he's blackmailing Dr. Mornay to help him with her expertise that I mentioned earlier. So I think what the film does is it revisits some of these wonderful things about turning into a wolf man, the monster, Dracula, etc. Some scenes at times similar to those from the more dramatic earlier films, but it finds a fresh way and a very funny way to rework them.
Boy, you make me want to watch it right now as soon as this interview is over.
Wonderful. Well, we both may just have to do that. All three of us should.
Well, Gary, we really appreciate your time. You have broken down one of these really great films, true classic, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. You've broken it down like few others could. Great insights on Lugosi, and also earlier the insights on the William Faulkner screenplay that never quite made it to film, but perhaps hopefully will one day. Gary, we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Always wonderful to be with you both. Thanks so much for having me back, and I wish you both so very, very well as always.
And we look forward to seeing your article on the Faulkner situation. Any idea where that might be appearing?
That probably will appear in the Journal of Vampire Studies, and then it will become a chapter in a book I'm writing about Hollywood vampire films of the 30s and 40s.
Terrific. We look forward to both of those. Our guest has been really the terrific writer, producer, director, expert on Bela Lugosi, expert on classic horror, Gary Don Rhodes. We appreciate Gary's time with us this past hour. We thank, of course, Tracy Asteria, my co-host and producer. We want to thank all of you for joining us in this Museum of the Macabre, and we hope you'll join us next time right here in the Ghostly Gallery.